Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the recently released open-world survival horror game Sons of the Forest, and see how it stacks up both visually and from a gameplay perspective to its predecessor, The Forest. For this analysis, both games are being played on the PC, with the graphics settings pushed up to their highest values at a native 4K resolution, though settings like DLSS, motion blur, and film grain will be disabled to provide cleaner still image captures. Also, bear in mind that Sons of the Forest has only just released in its early access state, and is therefore subject to change by the time of its final release. Alright, so let's kick things off by first looking at some character models, starting with the unnamed, mostly unseen lead protagonist. Now, generally, you wouldn't be able to see this character model, as the game is played entirely in first person, and there's no cutscenes or mirrors that I've run into so far. But of course, when playing in an online multiplayer session, everyone is assigned one of a few preset character models, all of which have a pretty simple look to them. The models in the original Forest in particular look like NPCs straight out of the old Tony Hawk Underground games, only with even less polished animations for walking, strafing, and jumping. Sons of the Forest makes quite a few improvements here, with better model geometry, shader work, shadowing, and hair rendering techniques. But weirdly, the character animations still feel just as stilted and awkward as before, sometimes even more so, like this animation used for player rotation. The other inhabitants of the island, however, are a different story, as they have better shader and texture work, along with some nice animation designs that allow them to smoothly traverse the environment. You can also expect increased variety with the sequel, with larger brute-like cannibals, some of which may even wield some unusual weaponry. Though many familiar horrors are also present as well, ensuring that there's enough new and old to please fans. The bigger changes to the enemies, though, are the improvements that were made to their AI systems. The original Forest had a surprisingly robust AI system that many players probably never picked up on, as their first instinct, mine included, would have been just to wail away at any creepy cannibal that came running up to them in the dark. But with a lot of patience, the enemy AI can actually be manipulated slightly to be more passive, and can even be trained to fear the player by means of grotesque effigies and other intimidation techniques. It's all subtly hinted throughout the game, but never explicitly explained, and the AI systems are purposely designed to be loose enough that it's difficult to predict what exactly these characters will do no matter what. The sequel carries forward these concepts, with various tribes of mutant cannibals roaming the island freely and interacting with the player, often with aggressive outcomes. Though there appears to be some slight refinement here, as I've come across a few unusual interactions between different mutants on the island. I've had some mutants hide in trees and wait for me to walk under them just to surprise me later, others that will perch themselves on a rock while our group was sorting through our inventories. And I've even witnessed some interact with unaffiliated AI in strange ways too, as if they knew each other. They still do weird things like clip through objects and stand on invisible platforms, but this doesn't feel nearly as common as it did before. And I do like the addition of things like ragdoll physics and full body deterioration in fire pits to help expand on the realism. Next up, we have the environments. As the name of the game implies, the forest takes place in a dense boreal forest region, isolated on a mysterious peninsula in an unspecified region. The game world is almost entirely forested, with dense vegetation including large cedars, maples, and figs, all of varying sizes. Along the forest floor, there's also a large variety of smaller flora like bushes, saplings, flowers, ferns, thistles, and weeds, along with a wide range of different consumable berries and herbs to make use of. In addition to plant life, the forest is also home to plenty of larger bodies of water, mainly ponds and lakes, along with its surrounding beach, a large snow-covered mountain region to the north, and a dense network of terrifying caverns accessible through special doorways hidden around the play area. For an independently developed early access game in 2014, the forest's environmental design is remarkable, and features a high level of interactivity, with almost every bit of vegetation blowing in the wind and capable of being pushed aside or destroyed by the player. And as this is a survival game, many of the materials from things like downed trees can be used to build shelter, making for a highly immersive experience. All that being said, I was a bit surprised to see just how poorly this game's environmental assets had aged. The forest floor, for example, is often barren in areas, with only a few of those 2D dynamic grass objects being spread throughout to give the illusion of depth. The texture maps used for the ground and trees are very low res as well, and the terrain geometry is incredibly simple, which stands out along these kinds of cliff faces. It's not necessarily all bad, as this game does have its moments, with all the tree branches blowing independently and leaves slowly cascading down and piling up on the ground. But then we have the environments in Sons of the Forest that is not only supposedly 4 times larger, but also 4 times more visually advanced as well. This new game takes place on yet another mysterious, uncharted location, with a lot of familiar visual aesthetics like plenty of dense forests, a snowy mountain range, and large bodies of water all about. But this is now a temperate forest, which is put on full display thanks to the game's new dynamic seasons that will cycle every few in-game days after using the sleep mechanic. Miles of green-topped trees will regularly transition to fall, with orange and red leaves raining down, before giving way to a barren winter with thick snow accumulation and occasional snowstorms. Smaller bodies of water like ponds will even freeze over, forcing players to find another source of water to stay alive. Spring will then bring color back to the landscape, along with pockets of pollen particles floating in the air, and regular rainfall, which will coat the world in a subtle wet texture layer, along with some increased specularity. As for the actual quality and complexity of this game world, Sons of the Forest sees much more vegetation packed into each and every frame, with more trees, more grass, and more flora in between it all. Trees are often wrapped in vines and ivy, while grass is now almost always covering up the underlying ground texture, making the world feel significantly more realistic as a result. The tree destruction has also been modified a great deal, with what looks like a sort of voxel technique to dynamically adjust the damage to the tree based on the angle and the weapon type being used to cut into it. Another major contributor to this more realistic look is Sons of the Forest's vastly superior lighting design. I think one of the more surprising realizations upon booting up the original Forest game was just how badly the old lighting design was. The world is soaked in this weird white light that doesn't feel natural in the slightest, and really hurts the quality of the various assets all around the player. Trees glow in a weird way, the sky is blindingly bright, and the grass almost seems to be reflecting that white light back upwards. The color grading is just all wrong, and while there are options to tweak this in the settings, none of the other color grade options feel right either. The Sons of the Forest, however, delivers something much more modernized. The default color tone is much warmer this time around, with lots of red and yellow mixing with the earthy tones to provide a much more northwestern forest feel. What's more, the volumetric lighting has been touched up too, with god rays that will pour in through the trees and interact with the occasional low-hanging fog and mist, whereas the original game only rarely had this type of light interaction and wasn't nearly as pronounced. Reflections are another area where the sequel has improved, as bodies of water now utilize a mixture of cube maps and screen space reflections to cast more accurate reprojections of the surrounding area, whereas before, the game relied entirely on cube maps that were incorrectly reflecting objects that weren't even there. The dynamic time of day effects also return more or less the same here, with roughly the same timing in place, and the same great and terrifying pitch blackness that the nighttime brings. Though there's now also dynamic cloud coverage that will block out the sun throughout the day, darkening the surrounding area. And the moon no longer shines nearly as bright as before, which should make nighttime adventures even darker most of the time. Dynamic player lighting is also very well done, as the light can be seen from a pretty long distance, and will realistically cast shadows via nearby environmental assets, especially the various stalagmites and stalactites in the caves. These shadow projections have similarly been given some much needed attention, with softer player model shadows, less dithering, and more accurate environmental shadows from things like tree leaves. The number of shadows cast is also very impressive, which helps immensely in giving the denser parts of the woods that proper feel, whereas in the original game, a lot of the ground assets failed to cast shadow, especially the grass. Next up, we have the various miscellaneous effects like water, that has gone from using a basic overlapping texture map to some slightly more sophisticated water physics simulation, with rolling waves on the beach, screen space reflections on the surface, and even ripple effects from player interaction. It's not necessarily the best water I've seen, as the physics only seem to apply to some objects and not others, and the ripples are short-lived and don't seem to truly impact the water body itself. But with all the additional babbling brooks, waterfalls, and large rivers, the improved water simulation is a nice upgrade. Fire has also seen some enhancements, as the animation loop is longer, more detailed, and fire interactions from things like Molotovs and fire pits will light enemies more realistically. Sons of the Forest also sees a big increase to the amount of particles used on screen, with better weather effects like rain and snow, along with pollen and other small particle effects that float around in the air when the light hits it just right. During the fall time, leaves will rain down from trees and blanket the floor, creating a stark contrast to the heavy snow that players and enemies can leave deep and persistent trails in thanks to a dynamic terrain deformation effect. I also noticed some interesting terrain deformation on normal ground in and around the area that we were building up, though it's unclear if this suggests that you can permanently wear down areas and create footpaths, or if this was just a weird texture warping bug that occurs as character models walk across the ground. Moving on, let's talk about a few of the biggest changes that have been made to the gameplay, starting with this guy, Kelvin. Kelvin is probably one of the most unusual additions to the sequel, as he's some sort of brain-damaged AI companion that you'll meet shortly after you arrive on the island. He doesn't talk, and he can't hear you either, so the only way to communicate with him is to give him written instructions using a notepad. By including this character, Sons of the Forest helps address the tedious nature of survival, by forcing him to do all the repetitive tasks like gathering wood, gathering food, and even building temporary shelters. It's a cool idea, though I did find him to be more of a liability more often than a useful asset. Not only does he constantly steal berries, get knocked out by the enemy, and light himself on fire by walking through fire pits, but he'll even stupidly chop down trees containing built structures when he's asked to look for more logs. Thankfully, the character is completely optional, and if you're tired of him making the situation worse, you can tell him to sit still and he'll stay out of your way. Though there is a bit of a charm to keeping this numbskull alive and just dealing with his idiocy. The next change is to the way navigation is handled. In the original Forest game, you were basically stuck using landmarks to navigate the peninsula, with established bases creating transparent UI icons in the world to follow to help you find your way back home. You could find a map eventually, which would automatically draw out a rough sketch of the island, but it wasn't helpful in actually discovering new areas or locations. Sons of the Forest greatly simplifies exploration thanks to a newly included GPS device. With this device, you can get a full layout of the surrounding area, including nearby water sources, paths, and even cave entrances, along with a few blinking icons and exclamation marks used to mark activated GPS tags hidden in the world. Once these tags are found, they can then be repurposed to mark other points of interest you might want to revisit later, which will be helpful when attempting to complete the game's main story and find valuable loot. The one thing I wish the sequel did have that the original offered are expanded options to customize the experience beforehand. Sons of the Forest doesn't let you minimize things like HUD elements, which I feel really hurts the horror aspect a great deal, especially when you're moving with a large group of players online, where all the names and health bars block out a sizable chunk of the screen. Sons of the Forest also sees a big update to its inventory screen, with a far larger map and better organization, as the original game's full inventory was a bit ridiculous towards the end. When crafting items, the new game also includes some fancy crafting animations, whereas before, items would just pop into existence once combined. And the amount of different items that players can find has been expanded too, with dozens of new weapon types, including actual firearms, suggesting that there may be more challenging fights to contend with this time around. My only big issue with this new inventory system is that there doesn't appear to be any option to use hotkeys anymore, relying instead on this clunky backpack hotkey instead, which often glitches out in the worst situations. And finally, there's the build system that has seen some pretty big changes too, as many structures can now be freely built using a new dynamic context-sensitive system, where you hold specific objects like wood sticks or logs, place them on the ground, and then build off of them. This should allow players to really customize their experience to fit their playstyle, allowing for more unique home-based designs and defensive ideas. However, there's definitely room for improvement here too, as many of the old blueprints from the first game, mainly water-based rafts and houseboats, have been removed entirely, and the new system can often be a bit finicky when trying to build on elevated terrain. Thankfully, there are still the old blueprint options to make use of, which include most of the old structures. But again, there are a few curious omissions that I hope we'll see return in the future. Finally, let's wrap up with a quick sound comparison. Which of these two games do you feel has the best audio quality and design? And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, The Sons of the Forest is a fantastic sequel to the original sandbox survival horror classic. I've been greatly enjoying my time exploring this beautiful yet disturbing world, and I'm very impressed with the general visual fidelity on offer too. What's more, the game runs really well on my rig, without any stuttering or significant FPS drops. Though there have been at least 2 instances where the game had locked up for a few seconds that I hope are addressed soon. And then of course, there's a few odd choices here and there, like the removal of aquatic structures and the inclusion of this guy. But the massively improved scale, the cleaner gameplay systems, and the emphasis on immersion really shows. And I'm looking forward to seeing this game evolve moving towards its final release. But what do you guys think? Are you happy with the early access build of Sons of the Forest? Or do you still prefer the original game? Let me know in the comments section. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.